This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. One of the tropes that gets talked about a lot in TV shows and movies, and often literature as well, comic books, video games, is what's referred to as bury your gaze. This is not about what you're looking at. This is G-A-Y-S. I did make the mistake the first couple times I heard this trope and was very confused. But it's about a trope that's been in media for quite some time, where when queer characters are introduced, gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, ace, etc., they do exist, but almost always they come to a very bad end, a bad end that is often death or being removed entirely from a situation or something terrible like that. And often not only that it happens, but that it happens either as kind of framed as a punishment for what, because they've just had their first kiss, they've just had their first awakening, or it happens as a way to further move along the straight characters' plot lines. It's the tragedy that helps inspire them to do what they need to do or something like that. If this sounds similar to the fridging conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, that's not coincidental. These two themes are, I think, very often linked. And one thing we're going to talk about is the sort of history and progression of the bury your gaze trope, and how at first it was kind of about everyone, and then for a while it was very much focused on gay men and AIDS, and then more recently it's been very much focused on queer women. And of course, we're not just talking about this in a vacuum, though, because part of why this has come up is that in the TV show Andor, Star Wars, and I'm going to have a spoiler for something in that happens in the first set of episodes, or the second set of episodes, my apologies, that is an important plot point, but I think it's been well discussed. But if you don't want any spoilers about Andor Season 2, hit pause, go watch that, come on back. But in that, there are two lesbian characters introduced. They were introduced in Season 1. They never really got to have like any big romantic, affectionate scenes together, though. In this, they've been separated for a while. They've kind of not been together. They come back together. They have a really beautiful, affectionate, sexual connection with each other. And then not shortly afterwards, one of them dies. And a lot of people saw this as a part of that bury your gaze trope. And there was also some arguments against that. And so what we're going to be talking about today, not necessarily because I think that it is helpful to have a rubber stamp one way or the other. This is bury your gaze. This is not. It's an evolving conversation. It's an evolving trope. The Hollywood response to it is evolving. But it's a good chance to kind of check in with this trope and why it's important and how it's important and how this fits into that larger conversation. For this conversation, we'll have myself, Matthew, my normal co-host, Riki, and we're also joined by special guest, A.K. Ahab. She's on her way to getting a master's degree in philosophy, so she's perfect in the kind of bullshit that is utterly at the heart and soul of superhero ethics. But also, she was with us on the Moby Dick episode, a number of Star Wars episodes, here with us to talk about queer themes in media all the time. A.K. Ahab, say hello and introduce yourself for those who haven't heard.
Hi. Nice to be back. Thank you for having me back. Yeah, I'm currently working on my master's in philosophy, and I'm a major nerd, so I love talking about Star Wars and other nerdy topics, as well as literary topics, because I did my undergrad spent a lot of time in English, media, and literature departments. So
Awesome. We're very glad to have you here. So give us some background. What exactly is the bury your gaze trope?
Yeah, I mean, the bury your gaze trope is essentially the idea that we introduce queer characters, and then often proximally to their first actual physical romantic encounter, one of the characters is suddenly and abruptly kind of killed off. Usually they don't tend to have much of a further impact on the narrative, so the kind of queer story is there, presented, is given this one moment of physical interaction and then immediately cut off from the narrative before the queer relationship has the opportunity to develop, and often before the characters really get to settle into their relationship, because it's often ended at the very kind of beginning of any sort of official physical relationship.
Yeah, I think that last part is also really significant, that it's not just about gay character death, although we'll talk about that in other times, that often it is specifically after the first kiss, after the first coming out, or even sometimes, you said, proximate to that, immediately before. Someone has a conversation with a friend and says, you know what? I am gay, I am queer, or I do have a crush on this person of my same gender, same sex. I'm going to go up and tell them I like them, or give them a kiss, or ask them to the high school dance, whatever it is. And then almost always tragedy happens to them.
Yeah.
And Riki, what has been your knowledge of this trope? Kind of, how did you first get introduced to it, or what's kind of your understanding of it?
Yeah, so I was kind of familiar with this trope, the name of the trope, but I hadn't really paid much attention to it until you mentioned it. It was like it clicked to me, like, yeah, like I understand like what why you're pointing this out. So I
Mm-hmm.
had to do some research on it, and it sounds like the big thing was this show called The 100 on the CW was like the kickoff point for it, and
Yep.
I found that very interesting. And so I read up on it, and then I've also read up on like the history of, the Hays Code, the television code, all of these older things that defined what could be shown in media. And there's a lot of that mixed in. So I
Right.
didn't know too much going in. I was just kind of familiar with the phrase and the idea. And now I'm really excited to get into this discussion.
Yeah. Well, and let's start with some of that history because I think it's really important in framing it both in terms of like the literal way it did, but also just the subtle ways it has affected things. And the Hays Code, and there's a similar code in television. Both of those come from the 1950s. But all the way back to the 19th century, there was a law passed in Britain about the sort of media depiction of sexual perversion as it framed it. And it was kind of a shift because instead of saying that you cannot do these things, what these laws started to say was that it is okay to depict bad behavior. You just can't depict it as virtuous. It always has to be shown as, aren't you glad that you're not doing those things? So the criminals can never get away. They always have to be punished. An adulterous woman has to have some bad end come to her. Not as much an adulterous man, by the way. How interesting. The person who kind of, goes against the church or something like that has to have something bad happen to them. Definitely any communists or anything like that. And then especially with gay and queer characters, this has to happen. And so you had a number of movies in the 40s and 50s and 60s where you would have a gay character, but they would be introduced as there's a famous movie in particular with Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine, whose name I can't recall at the moment, but in which like one of the characters is a lesbian, the other like she tries to seduce the other one. They might have a moment, but the other one kind of realizes she's being, quote unquote corrupted, pulls back, and then the character who was the sexual aggressor winds up unaliving herself at the end of the movie. And that's kind of used often as a classic example of this trend of, you can have those characters, but they always have to come to a bad end. And I think that's often where the link between they have to die directly related to that first sexual experience of some kind. There's also a trend that gets talked about, and Buffy is a great example of this, of anytime a young woman loses her virginity or has that first sexual experience, something awful has to happen to her fairly soon afterwards. And it's that same kind of idea of you can show the thing, but you have to show that it's bad and there are consequences and kind of scare people away from it.
Yeah, Buffy did both things,
Yeah.
right?
Buffy's also very much a bury your gaze.
I know the like trope of essentially like having a sexual encounter and immediately being followed by some sort of violence or death is a really big horror trope that dates really far back as well. It's pretty common in horror literature and genre horror
Mm-hmm.
in general to see that characters engage in some sort of sexual or physical interaction and then immediately something bad happens, and that's been um, around for a really long time in the genre.
Right. And I'll say, especially in horror, not to critique this, but I think this is a fair critique of sort of mainstream, like big budget horror, especially in the 80s.
Yep.
Often this was a way to kind of have your cake and eat it too, because you would show, the half naked girl making out with a guy, and you would get that kind of salacious TNA on screen, but then she immediately dies horribly. And so you could say, oh no, we're not. That gratuitous nudity was totally a moral lesson,
Yep,
not just because it
exactly.
gets 16-year-old boys to buy tickets.
Yeah, and I read the same thing about gay relationships is that this might have been a way for writers who are possibly gay and still in the closet because we're talking about the 50s for them to write gay characters into their story to get any kind of representation
Yep.
depiction on screen, but because of the various media codes, they had to give them bad endings, often death.
Right.
But that was kind of their way of circumventing the rules and saying, hey, like, gay characters exist in this thing I'm writing.
Exactly. And I think the later trend of queer coded villains is also very much that same kind of idea of like, there's an interesting balance of like, if your choices are to only put these characters in with negative portrayals or to not have those characters in at all, I don't, we can blame the overall media world for it, but like, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, those writers should have just had no queer characters in their worlds at all. It's a really hard balance to fit.
Yeah, because you mentioned Andor as the kickoff point for this discussion. This Cinta and Vel in Andor was the first like canonical gay relationship in Star Wars, right? Like at least in like the visual
Yeah.
media.
In a developed way. I think you had it in, that one kiss at the very end of Rise of Skywalker between two women. But I think, as you said, that's the first same-sex existing. Yeah. This is the first same-sex relationship, and it does feel like that was created in part, in response to this. But just getting back to more of the history for a second, I just want to trace it a little forward because there's another sort of period to discuss here. We start coming out of the Hays Code, more stuff starts to become possible, and now we enter the world of gay tragedy, where it's not quite the bury your gays trope because it's not always connected to first kiss, first things like that, although often it is. But starting in the 80s and 90s and so into the 2000s, you start having a trend where queer characters, especially gay men, are introduced, almost always will wind up dying of either HIV/AIDS or of suffering some horrible violence in a queer bashing way in some sort. And there are some stories where this happens as part of a larger queer narrative where it makes sense as like one thing among many. But when it was the one character and it serves again to be a tragedy for the straight characters to reflect on or to drive their journey, as well as just this portrayal of the only way queer characters can exist is tragic. AK, talk more about kind of that trend in the 80s and 90s and sort of where it's problematic and how so.
Yeah, I'm a little less familiar with the period specifically of the media in the 80s, the queer media in the 80s, I guess. But what I am aware of so far is the general attitude towards AIDS and towards HIV was like generally atrocious, and it was weaponized really aggressively against the queer community, and became kind of synonymous with the queer community, especially queer men. So there was little depiction that didn't involve some conversation, some discussion, some narrative about AIDS, HIV, because there was just generally like this really big health scare that got linked to queerness, and the way that disability and queerness and health have always kind of been entangled and weaponized against one another.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just to give kind of a personal illustration, when I came out as bisexual to members of my family, one of them, the first response they had was, well, I'm really worried you're going to get AIDS. Or something terrible is going to happen to you. And at the time, I really was upset about it. And I still think it's not a great response, but I recognize that it was said with love. And it was said because, this person was experiencing media where the only thing that happened to masculine people who were queer was they were victims of gay bashing or they got HIV and died of AIDS.
Yeah, and I also think there was a big highlight, especially not even just in fiction media, but in nonfiction media as well, of people who contracted HIV or AIDS, and then their deaths were kind of highlighted or publicized in ways that otherwise wouldn't have been, which also highlighted it and amplified that effect.
Right, for sure. And I think this can lead to a critique that we'll talk about, especially as we get to Andor, but even just start here of, does this mean you can't, gay characters should never die on screen, or that we should ignore AIDS? Because it was obviously an incredibly significant part of queer history and gay movement in the 80s and 90s and continues to today. Have either of you seen the movie or the play Rent?
No.
Mm-mm.
Okay. Odd that I'm the Rent expert here, but I'll say that's actually, I think, a great, for people who have seen it, I'll just fill you guys in a little bit, forgive spoilers for something 30 years old. That's a story entirely about, not entirely, but primarily about queer characters, where queer characters are a very large part of the world, and some of them have HIV, and one of them does die of AIDS. And I think, though, that that's often held up as a counterexample of this is not the problem, because often the issue with the bury your gays thing or the queer tragedy thing is it's the only character or one of the only two characters in a larger, mostly straight example, whereas this is the character Angel does have a wonderful, happy life before she passes away, and other characters get to have wonderful, happy lives. And so, to me, that always kind of highlights the idea that part of the problem is not just one gay character out of many dies; it's that one of, or the one in the only queer relationship is the one who's suffering the tragedy.
Yeah, this came up when we were discussing the Flanagan show, um, The Haunting of Bly Manor, right?
Right.
Where there was a primary gay relationship and one of them dies. And we were like kind of going back and forth because they did have a pretty good, happy life, up until the death. And it's like, yeah, like I thought it was a good nuanced story. I can understand why a lot of people would be like, well, again, a gay character has died, a lesbian has died. So that's where I'm coming from is like, yeah, I understand the trope
Right.
and I understand why it can be upsetting. But I also feel like, I come from, I watch a lot of horror movies too.
Right.
And in those, like, I just kind of expect everyone to die in most cases. It's like, okay, if you're gay, that's good. And in fairness to horror, there have started to be more gay, like, final girls or like final guys.
Mm.
So they are like circumventing the trope. And it's just like the more gay characters you have in a horror movie, the more likely one of them will survive. So that's like the thing, right? Like if you only have one gay character in a horror movie, they're probably going to die because most of them
Right.
are. So just have more. I
Yeah.
think is like my thing when it comes to horror.
Yeah. And to be clear, when I was talking about horror there, I'm talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street, the Friday
Oh
the
yeah.
13th, which I love, to be clear, but like that is worlds different than some of the independent horror that's coming out, or other stuff where horror is really being used to push the boundaries of filmmaking and to talk about things you can't talk about in other genres. Maybe it's almost more the slasher film form of
Yeah.
horror that I'm talking about, where there's almost always a topless girl who the camera is very focused on until she dies brutally,
Yeah.
kind of things.
Yeah.
I actually had one I watched recently. Hang on just a quick sec. What was this movie called? It stars Justin Long, but it's not Jeepers Creepers. It was shoot. Why is this not in? Okay, it's called It's a Wonderful Knife. And it's
Mm.
a Christmas horror movie
Nice.
where the main character is a woman and she starts out she's like, I think she's a high school student. She starts out in a heterosexual relationship, and then through the course of the movie, she finds out that her boyfriend has been cheating on her, so she dumps him. And then by the end of the movie, she is in a queer relationship. So it was a very interesting kind of development of this character in a horror movie, no less. So I really liked it. It was really cheesy. It's just a cheesy slasher movie, but
Yeah.
I found it very interesting. Like I was saying, because horror movies often are kind of
Mm.
at the edge of development in certain things within movies, because I think they can get away with it.
Yeah.
Um, I think it was a good one.
Well, and I think one thing that we're seeing is, and I think this is somewhat similar to fridging, is that in recent years there's been a real focus on this trend and real drawing attention to it and a real calling out of it, which means that a lot of us are a lot more aware of it and are noticing it more, but also means that it's starting to happen a lot less because a lot of people are starting to say, hey, we should maybe stop this, and there's been some movement. So let's go back to Ricky. You brought up the 100. AK, were you a fan of that show?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about what happens in the
Okay,
100?
please
Yeah.
tell us,
So
because I read about this. I was like, I don't even remember the show.
yeah, so I have kind of mixed feelings about the articulation that the 100 even falls into the barrier gay trope, but it's certainly, I understand how people took it that way. So what happens essentially is you have a main character who has been in a straight relationship, or a straight appearing relationship, in a relationship with a man, and she falls in love with another woman. Her and this other woman, their names are Clark and Lexa. They have their first sexual encounter, and literally within almost the same scene, Lexa is killed and dies and ceases to exist from the show for a pretty long duration of time. And people were really upset because it was the first depiction of a queer relationship in the show that had been around for a while. We'd seen a number of straight relationships, we'd seen a number of straight romances, but this was really the first queer interest at all between any characters. And it was kind of a slow burn. Like, these characters had known each other for a while. They'd gone through a bit of like a enemies to lovers move, and they finally get together, and then Lexa dies. And people were really upset, and I was upset too, because like it was just I think it was just upsetting, even if, you know, if you take anything having to do with bury your gaze out of it, it was just shocking. But then in the consideration of the fact that these were the only queer individuals in the show thus far, it seemed like it was very intentionally done, because a lot of other characters got to have sex and got to have sexual relationships and got to live those relationships out in the show. I'm a little less familiar with the kind of like online discourse. I got to the show a little late, so I kind of read things backwards rather than being involved in the discourse as it was coming out. But as the show goes on, more queer characters are introduced. Clark gets other queer interests and queer relationships, and Lexa kind of comes back as a almost like ghost form character in one of the seasons, where there's this weird thing happening with some like AI technology, and actually has a pretty strong impact on Clark's story, and very much, I think, like haunts the narrative. Like, she isn't completely forgotten. Clark talks about her through the rest of the show, all the way into the end of the show. But obviously at the time that Lexa died, nobody knew that was going to happen. And those things didn't happen until, I think, at least another season or two onward. And so, you know, there is, I think, some redeeming qualities to the show where it's like, okay, maybe in hindsight, this wasn't as much of a barrier gaze as we might have thought. But in the moment, it was very concerning, because there were all these other relationships happening. And while people were dying, they died at least far enough out from the relationship being developed that we felt like we were getting some sort of satisfying emotional investment in the relationship.
And from your understanding, was that kind of always the plan? Like we said, it would happen with Clark's character and with Lexa coming back? Or do you think that was someone in response to...
I think it's a little hard to tell. The kind of plot line that develops there is that Clark, or Lexa, is the commander of the Grounders, and she's got this AI chip implanted into her brain that carries her consciousness on to the next commanders. And so there was always, I think, the idea that Lexa's spirit or Lexa's consciousness was going to kind of haunt Clark through the rest of this narrative. And it seems like the AI arc that comes afterwards is pretty intentionally designed to give Clark and Lexa like this kind of reconciliation moment, but it's very brief. It's not particularly drawn out. So I do think it was probably at least like in the cards for Lexa to have some further interaction in Clark's story and some further, you know, direct involvement in that story. And Clark pretty immediately has other queer relationships that are not as emotionally invested, but certainly like we get other sex scenes with Clark and women. But yeah, I don't know if those were planned.
Right. Well, I do think those things are important, because, again, that sort of illustrates that it's not that the relationship just existed for their death, because often it's that the other character, therefore, kind of falls off the radar screen. And one thing I think it's important to stress in terms of how this became kind of the symbol of this, because it is funny that sometimes the thing that becomes the symbol often isn't actually the best example, but it happened during a period between February 22nd and March 20th of 2016, in which four major queer characters, or four major characters who had queer awakenings, all died on four different shows within a month of each other. And so I think in some ways that was also probably just as big a fact of like Lexa's, I think was I think the second one of those, but the fact that it happened on these four different shows, and so all this media conversation was happening at the same time. And also, by the way, that was like this happened in the season finale of the 100 season 3 finale. And a lot of them happened. And the season finale is when you want to have that shock value, and when you want to like hit audiences with things that then they're going to talk about all summer, that it became kind of the perfect storm of, hey, there is this trope. This is making us really aware of it. Let's focus on this. And Lexa becoming kind of the banner for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you said this is 2015 or
2016?
2016. Okay. But that's like in this period of time in history where online discourse, like especially on Twitter, was
Mm-hmm.
at a peak, right? And
Yep.
I like reading about it. That is what struck me, is that people were like tweeting the hashtag bury your gays. The creator of the show was responding to the
Yep.
criticism online, which I think happens less now because a lot of creators are like, I don't even want to get involved in this, just like
Mm-hmm.
leave it. So it was this weird time period where there was this interconnectivity between fandom and creators, like a lot more, I think, than now, because they were willing to engage, because
Right.
fandom was maybe less toxic. I don't know. It was starting to peak, and I'm not saying like this fandom was being toxic, but like this kind of discourse would lead to situations where the worst actors would make it toxic, right? Like, I'm not trying to
Yeah.
blame the entire fandom here,
Yeah.
but when you have this interconnectivity and this momentum, that's when the worst comes out.
And I think it's also important to remember that the larger historical context of 2016 was obviously the presidential election that year that
Yeah,
got
yeah.
very ugly, and during which, we had a period through a lot of like the early 2000s when outright displays of homophobia were pretty much understood to not be socially acceptable. And 2016 is a time when there's always been some pushback to that, but that becomes kind of to a head. There's an awful lot more overt homophobia being expressed online, and I think therefore that makes people a lot more aware of these kind of things. Because you're right, like I would go to a movie in the 90s where yet another gay male character either died of AIDS or was queer bashed, and I'd talk to my friends about it. We talk about how annoyed we were about it. Maybe one of us would post in our like email to 20 people about it. But we didn't have the kind of internet that we do now. And so there wasn't just those chances for like, we didn't call it bury your gays because we weren't talking to people all over the world about the same trend. And so let's talk about what happened then, because this is an example, interesting, I think, even more so than fridging necessarily, where there was a pretty direct response after this call out in 2016. Is that something you can tell us more about, or I can do more?
I'm a little less familiar about the direct response in 2016 because I wasn't on the internet as much.
No problem, no problem. So there was a real kind of awareness drawn to that, and I think the result of the presidential election, and then a lot of people kind of being like, "Oh my God, we have this real problem." And so shortly afterward, I think in 2018, but I'm not sure, a number of the kind of queer media organizations like GLAAD or other queer organizations in general like GLAAD started really pushing for this, and there started being some agreements of studios and things like that they would really try not to do this as much or to be more aware of it. And in what I think is a really interesting example as a comparison to what you were saying, where Lex died and everyone was so upset, even though the show was planning to do something, or maybe was planning, but give them that credit. Without spoiling it, one of the Star Trek shows that came out in the late 2000 teens had a gay character die rather tragically. And I remember a lot of people were like really upset about this, myself included. And the day after, a press release went out by the studio and this organization that had been formed about like, stopping bury your gays, or something. I forget the exact name of it, but basically they both like jointly signed on of like, these queer activists saying, look, we know what Star Trek is doing. They're going in a direction with a storyline that we're okay with, that we think is interesting and important. This isn't bury your gays, don't worry. And like on the one hand, it was a huge spoiler because as what wound up happening was the next season, through cool sci-fi moves, the character fully came back to life. Or turned out was like had never fully died, sci-fi mumbo jumbo, etc. But that was really sort of an interesting moment of like, as opposed to this, where like there was just no sort of acknowledgement of, hey, this is gonna be really hard for audiences. Instead, there was this moment of, okay, hey, we know it's gonna look like this thing. Don't worry. And similarly, they had also done that with an Asian woman character who died and also came back later. And there was a similar sort of like, look, we know it looks like we just killed off our biggest woman of color character. Trust us. She's not going to stay dead. And we can argue
you're talking about my Empress.
I would try not to spoil things, but yes, I suppose with that one it became pretty obvious because unfortunately there haven't been many Asian women characters in Asian women characters in Star Trek. But yes, And like we can debate whether that's a good strategy or not, or things like that, or is it this but I do think it's interesting that at least now there's a real attention given to this as, hey, warn people, let people know this is a thing. Maybe to help them, maybe just to cover your ass. Who knows?
Yeah, I do think there's like some interesting elements of, you want to let a show play itself out before making all your judgments, but at the same time, in the capitalist world we live in, you never know if a show's going to get to finish itself. And you're also
true.
watching media for the sake of enjoyment and like relaxing, or at least like interest. And you don't want to keep watching something if you think that they're going to be killing off all their queer people or all their people of color.
Yeah.
So I think that that's probably a reasonable line, especially in the political moment they were in, to just be like, hey, we know this is what it looks like. It's not what's happening. Trust us, hear us out for a minute.
Right.
And in media right now, your views is your power. Like you watching is like your vote, so to speak.
Right.
So if you stop watching a show because it becomes less interesting because a character you like has died, like that's your choice, and I think you should make it.
Yeah.
And that's you letting the creators know, like, hey, like look how many people stopped watching after episode 9, right? Like so.
Right.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people who did stop watching and then later came back because they were explained what happened. I think that's legit too. I also think it's interesting as another kind of example of how people are responding to this. You get shows like Schitt's Creek. Schitt's Creek is a comedy that kind of changes a lot. Like a lot of shows, I find I'm not a big fan of the first season, but it gets a lot better in later seasons. The creators, one of whom is well known to be gay and has been very upfront about that, like said from the beginning, he wanted this to be a show about characters, some of whom are queer, but where queer tragedy was never a part of it. And it wound up being, it was kind of like a safety blanket of, look, we're going to let you enjoy these queer characters knowing bad things are going to happen to them, but it's never going to be about that. And the relationship between Jonathan and David is considered like one of the best of any relationships portrayed on screen, but especially of a queer relationship. And they do have one real fight between their families. And there's this sort of buildup of one of their families is really not happy with the fact that these two are together. And I remember sort of being like, wait, are they going to break their promise? Is the family going to be upset they're gay? As it turns out, the idea is that one of them is from a very, very rich family and the other one is from a very poor family. And those parents are concerned, like, are we going to be judged? Are we going to be seen as backwoods hicks because we don't know what fork to use at the fancy dinner and stuff like that? And I'm making a joke out of it, but it's portrayed as a serious concern because that is a legit concern that people can have. Because there are many reasons why families of two people getting married might clash. And the way the show did it of like, we're not going to say that everything is perfect with them. We're going to say that they have the exact same kind of problems that other couples have. They fight about various things involving their careers and money and, who cleans the dishes and stuff like that. But the fact that they're the same gender is never the part of what they're fighting about. And that was, it's funny to say that, but that was revolutionary in many ways because it had never really been done before.
Another example where I think that's done very well is in The Dragon Prince between Amaya and Janai, because their relationship goes through all kinds of complicated problems and they have all kinds of social problems, but none of them are related to their queerness.
Yeah.
It's all related to other cultural elements and other, world building disasters that are happening, but they're allowed to just be queer.
Yeah. That's really cool. And that's an interesting example of intersectionality as well, because that's a show that I can't watch because I really don't like the way they handle prosthetic a character who doesn't have all their limbs. But that's a whole other story entirely. There's a lot we could say about this whole trope in general, books and articles, and some great things have been written about it. Some I'm going to post in the show notes. But let's talk about how this happens in Andor and how we see what happens in Andor in this larger discussion. And again, the point isn't to say like, give it the rubber stamp, officially it is or it isn't, but just what does this say about the trope and how do we feel about what happened? Riki, do you want to just tell us just the summary of what actually happens to these characters in Andor?
Yeah, so the characters of Cinta and Vel are shown to be in a lesbian relationship. They are part of the rebellion. They're spies. They're essentially terrorists against the Empire. And they have been apart in season 2 for quite some time, and that's made a big deal of that they haven't seen each other. And then they finally come together on a mission on a planet called Gorman,
Mm-hmm.
and they're involved in training the local rebellion to fight against the Empire and to help them with one of their first heists.
Right.
And during the course of the heist, one of the local Gore, basically a kid, disobeys orders and brings a blaster on this mission
Right.
when he wasn't supposed to, and gets in a fight with a guy who just kind of walks in on the thing, and the blaster goes off, and Cinta is shot via friendly fire by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And it's played very tragically, and Vel gives a very good speech to the kid. And yeah, I can understand, like, to me, when you said, "Oh man, this is bury your gaze," it's like I wasn't. I think I said, like, I don't see it or I don't feel it, because
Mm-hmm.
the show Andor is like everyone dies almost, right? Like, certain characters have to make it to Rogue One, etc. But I was expecting most of those people who aren't in Rogue One to die over the course of this show, and a lot of them do. But I do think the way that they told this story, like in these episodes between Cinta and Vel, was problematic. Like in the
Mm-hmm.
execution, the character of Cinta in particular, the one who died, was just like razor thin. She didn't get enough screen time. Wasn't presented as important enough. When I said that Vel gave a nice speech, she talked about how much of a warrior Cinta was and how fierce she was. I'm like, that's a great speech. You didn't show us that at all. You barely gave her any screen time. So I think that was the disappointing aspect. And of course, like the accidental friendly fire, a fierce warrior was taken out by friendly fire from this stupid kid, right? And that is reminiscent of the way a character went out in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think Matthew and I briefly talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like it's hard, like, as you said, like it's hard to like check a box and say, is this barrier gaze or is it not? I think there
Right.
are aspects where like lots of characters die, but the execution of this was one of the clumsier and least, unfortunately, like least impactful deaths, at
Right.
least to me. Like I did not feel as bad for this one as much, and almost kind of like felt it was telegraphed by the way that they showed the relationship. Like they came back together and like, oh, we can finally be together again. I'm like, not looking good.
Yeah. And just to add a further, again, looking at it from the intersectional lens of like it's not just the one thing, it is an it is an interracial relationship in which Vel is white and Cinta is not, and
Yeah.
Cinta being the one who died was also kind of a part of it. Um, AK, what about you? What was your take on that scene?
Yeah, I did feel quite a strong emotional impact from the scene. I think that the what was very interesting to me in Vel and Cinta's relationship building out of season 1 was that Cinta is very clearly all about the rebellion.
Hmm.
And the relationship with Vel takes a back seat to the rebellion, and that is a point of tension between them. And I think that the way they come back together and you know, Cinta has clearly been through some things and kind of says, maybe the rebellion is going to take the second seat now, or maybe I needed to reevaluate my values, was really beautiful. And I was really devastated when
Yeah.
then she immediately dies. Um, for me, I don't know that I would have thought it as a barrier gaze if there were more gays in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Because I think within the context of the show, almost every couple is broken apart, and not just romantic couples, but every pairing that we have is split up, broken, one dies, etc., etc. The problem is this is like the first queer relationship we've ever had on screen for Star Wars as a whole. And I do think it becomes difficult with franchise work because you don't want to restrict creators of an individual show and say, oh, if you're going to do this thing, you have to do it this way because the rest of the franchise has essentially failed to represent. But I do think it's something worth considering, because I think if this was one of many queer stories within Star Wars, it would make sense in the context of the tone of Andor, in the context of it is fairly realistic that like someone not following orders results in the tragic death of someone that doesn't make sense. Like a lot of the violence, a lot of the death in Andor is senseless, and I think that that's part of really the heart of the show.
Right.
Like this is a mess. And it's a mess because of the nature of the Empire and what rebellion means. But I think that, you know, again, considering these are the only queer characters that we have in the whole franchise, kind of makes that feel much worse in a context where it otherwise might not. Even if they were the only queer characters in the show, the franchise writ large had more queer people represented outwardly on screen, I think I would feel much better about it.
Yeah, I think I'm really kind of where you are, and I think this is definitely a case where, and you can say this is fair or unfair to, you know, Tony Gilroy, the larger trope had a big effect on me for this because, as you said, a not only has there not been many queer characters in Star Wars, up to this point, there was that kind like there was that like kiss at the end of Rise of Skywalker, which felt almost like if anyone's seen some of the videos making fun of the Target Pride collection this year, this is gonna sound a weird connection, but like they're having a Pride collection, but like the word Pride never appears. It's authenticity, which is hilarious because the whole thing is incredibly. It's basically like the most dialed down, watered down. A conservative walking through the store won't be offended, but we can still say we have a Pride Month thing going on, and that's kind of how that kiss at the end of Rise of Skywalker felt.
And just to be clear, because I think when you said kiss at the end of Rise of Skywalker, I immediately went to the Rey Ben Solo kiss.
Oh no,
what you're talking about is in the celebration after they win. They are
right.
there's briefly shown that two women in the background of the celebration are kissing.
One of
And I think
whom
it's been said that has actually been erased from the movie in other media markets because it's just so brief.
Yeah, and I think like one of them has a brief role in the coup attempt in Last Jedi. The other is like barely known. I don't have any idea the names of either of the two characters. I could recognize one of them. And there has been an awful lot of queerness introduced in other parts of Star Wars, to be clear. It's never officially on screen, but Zeb and Callus has certainly been kind of made canonical in a lot of things. Book Star Wars and video game Star Wars has an awful lot of explicit queerness, but there's been very, very little in live action. And so I think, again, this show having it, and then also in the first season, them naming it, but the characters almost never get to spend any time as a happy couple. They don't get to kiss. They don't, almost all the time, it's about the mission separating them. And so you have the fact that then we finally get that moment that people had been screaming for back in season 1 and that people have been wanting in Star Wars all around. And then literally the same episode or the same arc is when she dies. So all of that felt kind of bad. And then you also just have the fact that we do exist in this larger media market. I had a different reaction to either of you, honestly, because the minute we started to get that scene, my first thought was, don't you dare make this a bury your gays moment. Because I'm so primed for that. I'm so primed for the queer characters get a happy romantic moment, now they have to be punished. And so when it did happen, instead of getting to experience Cinta's death and Val's pain, which are both, I think, legitimate emotional moments that were well written and were wonderfully acted, instead my thought was, God damn it, it's another bury your gays moment. And is it fair that Tony Gilroy and the rest of the writers and directors have to think about that when they're writing this? No. But is it a reality? I think absolutely yes. In the same way.
Well, it's also not, it's not fair we have to think about it.
Yeah.
Like, if we have to think about it, show creators should also have to think about it. And that's not fair, but it is where we're at.
Yeah. In the same way that, like, it being the woman it being the woman of color who dies, because that's again been I don't know if it was ever given a pithy name, but all through the 80s and 90s, in an awful lot of like the Schwarzenegger and action movies like that, you'd give that character a black best friend who would die. And that goes all the way to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where that's one of the big motivators for John Walker. So like, again, I don't want to be like, oh, this only happens to gay characters. There was just kind of, again, all of these things came together that for me, if you made me a list of the top 5 most egregious bury your gays moments and this wasn't in it, I wouldn't complain. But I feel like to understand why this moment was hard for a lot of fans to understand, you have to understand it in light of the bury your gays trope. Mm-hmm. Does that Riki kind of make sense of, like, it's not, I agree with you, it doesn't, it's different than the trope in a lot of ways, but it's similar enough that it still
Yeah, it
was
has
hard to see.
callbacks for sure.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things about what I've read about the 100
Yeah.
is that it comes at a time, like I said, when internet culture was like so connected, and to me that also means that like shipping culture was at its peak. And I think like especially CW shows, the fandom of CW shows are notorious shippers. So
Yes.
that like had also led to this buildup of like, oh, like we ship these two characters, we give them a cute smosh name, right? Like it was Klexa, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And then finally, like all that anticipation comes to a head. They get together, and then she dies. And I
Yeah.
think that's what leads to like even more of the disappointment of the community, because I admit, like I have felt that on shows where sometimes like the ship doesn't even come together, and that's also disappointing.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think two words we haven't mentioned, but I think are really important here are queer coding and queer baiting.
Yeah, yeah.
And we've
Mm.
discussed this on earlier issues, but queer baiting is where you're kind of intentionally giving the audience enough to think that a queer thing might be happening, but never really crossing that line. And so I think for some, there's a moment of when they fear it's queer baiting, you're like, oh my God, it's not queer baiting. It's real. It's real that, oh, one of them just died. And so, yeah, so it's this like bit, like, I think in some ways, if they had gotten together at the end of, if they'd had more of a connection at the end of last season and they hadn't been sort of romantically separated and had this big come together, if in season one they'd been much more established, that would have made it better. As you said, AK, if there'd been just more queer characters in general, that would have made it better, you know?
I also think if they hadn't made such a big deal of the reunion, like, we know that they're sleeping together from the minute we see them on screen in season one because it's mentioned by another character and we don't see it, but we know
Hmm.
it's happening. I think if we hadn't had this moment where Cinta and Belle come together and are both like, okay, we're going to prioritize each other now, like, let's have a reunion, then followed by the death, it also would have felt different. Because if they had been working together and we'd have seen from Belle's perspective kind of this longing, this yearning to prioritize the relationship, and Cinta was still like, no, 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 rebellion all the way, it would have felt different because it would have been like, oh, look at this tragedy, rather than like, oh, they just robbed us of something that they were like gonna give us and then didn't. But at the same time, we want those queer depictions on screen and we want to see people in those contexts. So it's like kind of difficult because it's really about the particular context that this all played out in, not just the things that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Like I said, one of the problems I had with the whole thing was like Cinta over this show, and especially season two, was just underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm.
And like at the end of the first arc, the first 3 episode arc of this show, she shows up for like less than a minute, and like Belle and her like look at each other, and it's like
Right.
just it felt like a reminder, like this character exists, like she'll be back later. And if that scene had been more developed and they had had a chance to talk or say
Mm-hmm.
something more and remind us of the relationship, maybe it would have been better, because it just felt like very rushed when it all happened in the 1 episode where they came together.
Yeah. I think it's very true. It's very true. The last thing I'll just say, and I think I fully agree with you, Riki, that in the moment there was some sense of like, well, this sucks, but everyone's going to die. Like, that's kind of the point of this. We got to the end of the show, though, and I don't think that was true. An awful
Yeah,
lot of the characters lived.
surprising number.
Yeah, Bix lives, Vel lives. I think both Will
Clea.
and Clea lives. Um, uh, Luthen dies, but he gets to die in like a very kind of like doing what he wants, of like protecting someone in a real like him for once not being willing to throw other lives out. Um, yeah, so I think that's also part of why, like, also in reflection, like, well, actually, did she have to die? Could it have been
Mm-hmm.
some other way of doing it?
I mean, it could have been any number of other characters, is the other thing,
Yeah.
because we have so many characters involved in kind of things going on in Gorman that we get to know, that we become emotionally attached to, who end up dying later and have emotional deaths. It's like it could have been a large number of people on that crew who were about as developed as Cinta, but it wouldn't have had the impact on Vel. And I think that's what they were going for. And I do love Vel as a character. but it's like, okay, well, you chose to make this your queer character and then to kill their
Yeah.
partner because
And I want to just close by saying, and let either you guys either respond to this or say anything you want to say in closing, because again, I do think that you're right, Riki. Even on topics I agree with, internet culture can somewhat be very toxic. I'm not sitting here going Tony Gilroy is homophobic. I don't think Tony Gilroy in any way was thinking of he wanted to punish or show that there was something bad about Vel and Cinta. I think he was going to like pull on our emotional heartstrings, which if you want to be like, oh, writers are writing is manipulative. That's the fundamental point.
Yeah.
It's to make us feel things. We call it manipulative when it feels obvious and like we don't feel it. And I think instead, I think Tony Gilroy is a brilliant, phenomenal writer and director who has done so much to add to Star Wars. And I get why he wants to write most of it himself. I think if he'd had some queer writers in the writing room with him or empowered them more to speak up, then maybe someone could have pointed out, hey, Tony, I know you don't mean this, but here's the way this is going to be kind of taken, you know? And again, I don't know actually what happened in the writer's room. Maybe someone did and Tony didn't listen. Maybe I have no idea. Maybe there were queer writers who were like, yeah, Tony, we love this. It's fine. But to me, it's that's kind of the larger takeaway here is I don't think we can. I don't think the point is to say like this writer is bad, you know, cancel them or any of that nonsense. It's to say this is a good example of why big diverse writers' rooms are good things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like I said, I don't know that this would be a problem if there was just more queer representation broadly, especially within the Star Wars franchise, because it wouldn't have been such a deep emotional investment from the queer community. So in isolation, maybe this would have read very differently in a different, you know, broader media context, and maybe not, but a lot of it has to do with problems that I think are going to be more structural than any individual writer is going to be able to address and are going to require more people involved.
The point you made about the deep investment, I think, matters, and also is why it's so important that it's in the same arc that happened the same night, because one person I saw online commented, like, she just wanted to have the week of everyone talking about how great it was that we had these two lesbian characters. You know, oh, wasn't that a hot scene? Like, wasn't that wonderful? And they didn't even get to have that. We didn't get to have that.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah, Matthew, I agree with you about the term manipulative. Like, when I'm watching a TV show, I want to be manipulated. Like, emotionally, I want to feel emotions, right? And for me, like, in season 2, the death at the end of the first arc, like, I felt very manipulated in a satisfying way. Like, I was, like, deeply invested and saddened. This one, like, I just didn't feel it as much because I felt like it felt telegraphed to me.
Yeah.
So when it happened, I was like, yep, it happened. Like, it wasn't a surprise, unfortunately.
And that's also a larger thing that isn't just about queer relationships. If two straight characters or two characters in a hetero-presenting relationship all of a sudden declare their love for each other the night before one of them goes into battle, I'm like, ooh, I want to take out a life insurance policy on one of you because one of you is not coming back. Like, that's just... That's a red, you know, put a red shirt on that character. Like, that happens as well. So, all right. Well, thank you all so much. There's been a fantastic discussion. AK, for people who are interested in what you've got to say and want to find more of your writings or work, where should they do that?
I'm on Instagram and TikTok as Iron Kingdom Adventures.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Of course, you can find more of me and Riki in the show notes, as well as becoming a member. We will have a brief member section. Well, as I've said before, we're recording this while we're on hiatus. I'm not sure exactly when this episode is going to go live. We're reevaluating the membership program, so it might be that you need to hear this last section about becoming a member. It might be that we should make it available for everybody. We'll see. That's future Matthew will decide that, but present day Matthew is recording it. So if that's the case, thank you all so much. Please become a member. $5 a month, $55 a year. And on behalf of everyone else, thank you so much. Live long and prosper. All right, welcome back. Well, let's end on a happy note because there are good queer relationships portrayed in media in lots of ways. And I'm not going to make it as like a top 3, you know, kind of thing, but just what are a couple of your favorites? Riki, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I had a long think about this. And as I said earlier in the episode, I too am a fan of cheesy CW shows. One of my favorites was Legends of Tomorrow, which is in the Arrowverse spinoff with time travel. So, you know, I love time travel. And that show to me had one of the best queer relationships between the main character, Sarah Lance,
Mm-hmm.
and a secondary character who was introduced maybe like halfway through the show, Ava, and they end up in a pretty stable relationship. Obviously, on these shows, you'll always have like episodes or arcs where maybe there's some trouble or they're fighting or they're separated, but ultimately they get married
Mm.
and have for as much as you can have on a superhero show, a happy relationship. So that was my first one. I loved that. My second one, I only have two. My second one was Robin from Stranger Things,
Oh
and
yeah.
I loved her. And maybe this is kind of bad because I loved her because of her relationship with Steve, who is a heterosexual man, but they have a friendship. And the scene where they are sitting in the like mall bathroom and talking to each other, and that's when she comes out to him
Mm-hmm.
as gay, and because he's like confessed his love in that
Right.
moment. He's like, I love you, and she's like, well, actually, like, I'm gay. I don't remember like the exact line. And he's like, oh, and he immediately like accepts her, and there's no backlash. It's like, well, you have terrible taste in women. Like, I think they make a joke, right?
Uh-huh.
Because it turns out like they both like the same girl or something like that. And I love that scene, and especially given that the show takes place in the 80s, like you would expect like backlash or queer bashing, and it didn't happen. He accepts her, like, so I really love that. And then like their friendship develops, and I don't think she ends up yet in a relationship. But again, there are shippers on that show, so we'll see what happens in the final season. So those
Mm-hmm.
were my two.
Yeah. I'll give one of mine, and then AK, give one of yours, or however you want to do it. Um, I already talked about the awesome relationship in Schitt's Creek, which I think is just so well
Yeah.
done. And there's a number of other characters who, there's a wonderful scene where one of those characters in what becomes a male male relationship, for a while is sleeping with a woman, and has just the most beautiful explanation of being bisexual or pansexual. I forget which one he identifies as. And it's a thing you probably have seen on the internet somewhere of like, sometimes I like red wine, sometimes I like white wine, etc. And it's beautifully handled. And again, there's no shame. It's just a hey, here's a thing. But the one I'll mention is one I have mentioned before on this podcast. Frank and Bill in The Last of Us, particularly the TV adaptation. It's season 3. It's episode 3 of the first season. And part of the further context of it is this is definitely a world where every single person dies, and the two of them do die at the end, although in a beautiful way, not from anything having to do with the tragedies of the world they're in. Just one of them gets sick, and the other decides they don't want to live without the other one in just a wonderfully romantic, dark but romantic way. And it is just such a beautiful depiction of anyone can find love in the midst of tragedy, as well as this idea of like when the world is ending, why in the world would you let your own inhibitions and shame and sort of self censorship of who you really are hold you back? So yeah, I think that is just one of my absolute favorites. Not exactly stretching there because it's often quoted, but AK, what about you? What's one of yours?
Yeah, I mean, I already mentioned Amaya and Janai from the Dragon Prince. I think they've got like a really drawn out arc. Like they do a classic enemies to lovers and forbidden love, and then they do end up getting married, and they get married amid a bunch of political strife that has to do with things unrelated to their queerness. I also just like that they are an interracial and interabled couple, and there are things about that that I think are also really beautiful. And generally, they're just pretty happy in their relationship. Like the world is falling apart around them, but their relationship is where they're safe and comfortable and happy. And they face challenges together that in a way that I think is just really beautiful. Um, I'm also a big fan of Karina and Bishop from Station 19.
Mm,
That general universe sometimes has some problematic, depictions of various things, but I felt like Station 19 did a pretty good job with Karina and Bishop. again, because there are like a lot of problems and a lot of complications in their relationship, but queerness isn't one of them. They're both very openly and proudly and happily queer, and they get together pretty easily and then stay together for quite a long time and face a lot of different kinds of challenges together. And they're one of the strongest, if not the strongest, pair in the entire show, which I think also stands out because there are a bunch of straight relationships that have like a lot worse things going on than the two of them. And the problems that they have, I think they face with a lot more maturity than some of the straight couples, which is a nice change of pace because I think sometimes queer relationships are trivialized or overly sexualized. But it was nice to see kind of the inverse happen where the straight relationships are the ones that are super messy and the queer relationship is like stable and healthy for the most part.
For my last one, I'm going to flip the switch on the stable messy thing and talk about Harley Quinn. And I'm going to talk about her in two different mediums, one animated, one live action. Where in both, she's an incredibly messy romantic character. That's who Harley Quinn is. But they managed to portray it in a way where the gender of the person isn't really relevant to it. And the first example I'll use is in the live action movie Birds of Prey, where the whole point is about her emancipating herself, that was literally in the title, from this string of bad relationships she's been in, the Joker being the most obvious, but also of others. And again, so the point isn't to have her in romantic relationships by the end of the movie. All they do is in a very small scene at the beginning of the movie, there's kind of an animated scene where she remembers all the people who've broken her heart, and one of them's a woman. And it's not commented on. It's not like, oh my God, you were the... It's just like, yeah, I've been with a number of people who broke my heart. Here was a guy, here was a woman, here was Joker. And I love that because it's kind of the flip side of we want queer relationships that are front and center. Here is a character who the whole point of the movie is about them moving away from defining themselves from romantic relationships. But oh, by the way, she's queer. And we're going to make that very canonically clear without it being a thing. And then the other portrayal of her, and this is somewhat about her, but even more about her, the person who becomes her partner, Poison Ivy, the animated show on HBO Max, Harley Quinn. And Riki, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit. She winds up with Poison Ivy, which is canonical to the comics as well. But for a while, Poison Ivy is in a relationship with a man named Kite Man. And he's portrayed a little bit for laughs, for sure. But a lot of times it's easy to do no, she's not really queer. Compulsory heterosexuality is a very real thing. And a lot of times people are in straight relationships that they don't really want to be in because they haven't accepted their own truth and all that kind of thing. That's very real. But also bisexual people exist. And sometimes bisexual people are awesome and wonderful. And sometimes people are with one person and fall in love with someone else. And they maybe have different genders, but the gender isn't the reason for it. And that's exactly Poison Ivy's story. She cheats on Kite Man. And the show doesn't lift her up as wonderful. It's not like, oh God, yay, shit on the heterosexual relationship you were in, yay for the, or not, she's always bi. Exactly, yeah, she's always bi. She's in a relationship with a man. It's not a great relationship for her. She's too cowardly to get out of it honorably. And she's kind of shitty to him. And the show is sympathetic to him while also saying, but she is in love with Harley, and people sometimes do not great things while finding the love of their life. And it's a show that's incredibly tongue-in-cheek. People die all the time. It's very much a celebration of villains who kill people by the hundreds and thousands. But even in that, the portrayal of her and Kite Man, and then her leaving Kite Man to be with Poison Ivy, and then of Kite Man getting another partner who's really nice to him, and her even being a little jealous of that. It was, to me, that was such wonderful bisexual representation, or pansexual representation especially, because it was, yes, one of her partners is one gender, yes, another partner is another, but we're not denying the importance or the sort of realness of either of those relationships. And that it's messy, and we're going to acknowledge the messiness without saying because of the queerness, it makes it okay.
Yeah. In Legends of Tomorrow, I believe Sarah Lance did start off in a heterosexual relationship, and then came out as bisexual and was with Ava.
Right. Well, and she's first introduced in the Arrowverse on the show Arrow that she's being with Oliver Queen for a while.
Oh, yes. That's right. That was her origin. Gosh.
Yeah.
So complicated.
Then she dies, and then she doesn't die, and then yeah.
I think she was played by a different actress in that one too, which is why I forgot.
Yeah. Well, no, but that actress does come back, and she's with Oliver on. She's part of the cast of Arrow for like a half season while they're setting up Legends of Tomorrow.
Is that right? It's been too long. I'll trust you.
AK, you were smiling a lot during my descriptions of Harley Quinn. Any last comments on that?
No, I mean, I just love good bisexual representation.
Yeah.
So
it's really nice to see. Well, thank you both. This has been a fantastic episode. Really glad we had this conversation. To our listeners, our members, thank you so much. You're what makes this possible. Be gay, do crimes. Be gay, do crimes.
Less crimes.
Yeah. Depends.
Some crime. minor crime, let's say.
Yeah. Just overthrow the government. And we're out.